Hey guys, tonight we descend into the lavish, absurd, and occasionally unsanitary world of medieval marriages, where childhood ended before it began. Politics trumped love, and absolutely no concept of modern boundaries existed in spectacular fashion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me warn you up front. This isn't going to be some romantic fairy tale version of medieval life. We're talking about a time when a 12-year-old girl could wake up married to a stranger 3 times her age, when wedding ceremonies doubled as peace treaties, and when the concept of marrying for love was considered about as practical as flying to the moon. Sound familiar? Well, it shouldn't, because thank goodness we've moved past most of this madness. Let's be clear about something from the start. When we talk about child marriage in medieval times, we're not dealing with some quaint historical curiosity. We're talking about real children. Kids who should have been playing with dolls or learning to read, instead finding themselves thrust into adult responsibilities that would challenge even modern adults. That's right. While today's 12-year-olds are worried about middle school drama and video games, their medieval counterparts were navigating political alliances, managing households, and facing the very real possibility of death in childbirth. Too. Be fair, the medieval world operated under completely different rules than ours. Life expectancy was brutally short. We're talking about societies where making it to 40 was considered a pretty good run. Childhood, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. Children were viewed as miniature adults who just happened to be temporarily inconvenient in size. The moment a girl hit puberty, she was considered ready for marriage, motherhood, and all the responsibilities that came with running a medieval household. But here's where it gets complicated. And this is crucial to understand. Just because something was legal or socially acceptable doesn't mean it was universally practiced, or that people were necessarily happy about it. Medieval parents weren't cartoon villains gleefully selling off their children. Most of the time, they genuinely believed they were securing their daughter's future in a world where a woman without male protection was vulnerable to everything from poverty to violence. Meanwhile, the church had its own complicated relationship with marriage. On one hand, they preached that marriage was a sacred sacrament blessed by God. On the other hand, they also believed that celibacy was the highest calling, which created this weird tension where marriage was simultaneously holy and kind of a consolation prize for people who couldn't control their lustful urges. Of course, this didn't stop church leaders from arranging plenty of strategic marriages themselves when it served their political interests. If you thought medieval marriage was just about 2 people falling in love, think again. Marriage was business, pure and simple. It was about consolidating land, securing alliances, ending wars, beginning wars, gaining access to trade routes, and sometimes just making sure your family name didn't die out because your only male heir decided to become a monk. Love? That was a luxury most people couldn't afford, Don. And yet, here's what's fascinating about studying this period. Even within this system that seems so foreign and harsh to modern eyes, you still find evidence of genuine affection, partnership, and what we might recognize as love. Medieval people weren't emotional robots. They felt joy, sorrow, passion, and heartbreak just like we do. They just operated within a system that prioritized survival and stability over individual happiness. The reality is that medieval marriage was a complex institution that varied dramatically, depending on social class, geographic location, and time period. A peasant marriage in 12th century England looked very different from a noble marriage in 14th century France, which looked different from a merchant marriage in 15th century Italy. Still, certain patterns emerge when we look at the broader picture, and those patterns reveal a world where childhood was brief, adulthood came early, And marriage was rarely a matter of personal choice. What we're going to explore tonight is the full spectrum of this experience, from the political machinations that determined who married whom, to the wedding ceremonies that sealed these deals, to the daily reality of what it meant to be a married child in a world that offered few protections and even fewer choices. We'll look at the legal frameworks that made all this possible, the religious justifications that made it seem necessary, and the social pressures that made it virtually inevitable. We'll also examine how these practices varied across different social classes, because let's be honest, being married at 12 as a princess was a very different experience from being married at 12 as a peasant's daughter. Both were challenging in their own ways, but the resources, support systems, and future prospects were worlds apart. Throughout this journey, we'll use specific examples of real historical figures who lived through these experiences, because numbers and dates can only tell us so much. It's in the individual stories, the letters, diary entries, and historical records that we really begin to understand what life was like for these young brides and their families. So buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into a world that was simultaneously more complex and more brutal than most people realize. This isn't a story with clear heroes and villains, but rather an examination of how human societies adapt to circumstances that seem impossible to modern eyes. And fair warning, some of what we're going to discuss is genuinely disturbing by contemporary standards, but understanding it is crucial to understanding how we got from there to here. Let's be honest about something that makes modern people deeply uncomfortable. In medieval Europe, the legal age of consent for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. That's right. According to both church and civil law, a 12-year-old girl was considered legally capable of consenting to marriage, sexual relations, and all the responsibilities that came with running a household. If you thought this was some obscure loophole that rarely got used, think again. This wasn't an accident or oversight in medieval legal systems. These ages were deliberately chosen based on when church authorities believed children reached physical and intellectual maturity. Canon law, which governed marriage across Christian Europe, explicitly stated that girls could marry at 12 because that's when they typically began menstruating, a sign that they were physically capable of bearing children. Meanwhile, boys had to wait until 14 because they were expected to be the primary breadwinners and needed those extra 2 years to develop the physical strength necessary for manual labor or warfare. To be fair, these weren't arbitrary numbers pulled out of thin air. Medieval legal scholars spent considerable time debating the appropriate age for marriage, drawing on everything from Roman law to biblical precedent to contemporary medical understanding. The problem is that their contemporary medical understanding was based on the belief that a girl's body was essentially a defective version of a man's body, and that her primary purpose was reproduction. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, variations of this thinking persisted for centuries. The legal framework surrounding these marriages was surprisingly sophisticated, even if the underlying assumptions were deeply problematic. Canon law required that both parties consent to the marriage, which sounds progressive until you realize that a 12-year-old's consent was rarely free from family pressure, economic necessity, or outright coercion. Still, the church did provide some protections. Marriages could be annulled if it could be proven that one party was too young to understand what they were agreeing to, or if they were forced into the union against their will. Of course, proving coercion in a world where daughters were expected to obey their fathers without question was nearly impossible. The legal system recognized different types of consent. There was the formal, public consent given during the wedding ceremony. And then there was what canonists called true consent, which was supposed to come from the heart. The gap between these two types of consent was where much of the tragedy of medieval marriage played out. Meanwhile, civil law varied considerably across different regions and kingdoms. In some areas, parents could arrange marriages for children as young as 7, with the understanding that the union wouldn't be consummated until the canonical age of consent. These early betrothal contracts were legally binding and could only be broken under very specific circumstances, usually involving proof that one party was already married, closely related to their intended spouse, or physically incapable of consummating the marriage. The concept of physical maturity was central to medieval marriage law, but it was understood very differently than we understand it today. Medieval people believed that menstruation was a sign that a girl's body was ready for pregnancy, regardless of her emotional, psychological, or even complete physical development. They had no understanding of the increased risks associated with teenage pregnancy, the importance of full skeletal development before childbearing, or the psychological trauma that could result from forcing children into adult relationships. And yet, even within this legal framework, there were some surprising protections for young brides. Church law prohibited husbands from consummating marriages with wives who were too small or physically immature, even if they had reached the canonical age of consent. Bishops occasionally intervened in marriages where young wives were being physically harmed by husbands who ignored these guidelines. Still, enforcement was sporadic at best, and many young brides had no recourse when their husbands chose to ignore church guidance. The legal status of married children was particularly complex. Upon marriage, girls legally transitioned from the authority of their fathers to the authority of their husbands, regardless of their age. A 12-year-old bride had the same legal responsibilities as a 30-year-old wife. She was expected to manage household affairs, oversee servants, and represent her husband's interests in his absence. If you thought being a teenager was hard, imagine being legally responsible for managing the finances of a noble household while still being young enough to play with toys. That marriage also conferred certain legal rights that unmarried women, even adult unmarried women, didn't possess. A married 12-year-old could own property, enter into contracts, and make legal decisions that would have been impossible for her as a single woman. This created the bizarre situation where marriage simultaneously restricted a girl's freedom by placing her under her husband's authority while expanding her legal capacity in other areas. The church's role in regulating these marriages was both protective and problematic. On one hand, church law provided the only real constraints on parental authority over children's marriages. Parents couldn't marry their daughters to heretics, close relatives, or men who were already married. They also couldn't force their daughters into religious life against their will, which was important since convents were often used as dumping grounds for unwanted daughters. On the other hand, the church's emphasis on marriage as a sacrament meant that once a union was blessed, it was extremely difficult to dissolve, even in cases where the bride was clearly too young or unwilling. Annulment was theoretically possible, but it required navigating complex church bureaucracy and often involved significant financial costs that most families couldn't afford. By the 13th century, some legal scholars were beginning to question whether 12 was truly old enough for girls to make such momentous decisions. Thomas Aquinas, whose theological writings influenced church law for centuries, argued that while girls might be physically capable of marriage at 12, they lacked the intellectual and emotional maturity to truly consent to such a significant commitment. Still, his concerns didn't translate into changes in actual practice for several more centuries. The enforcement of marriage laws varied dramatically, depending on social class and geographic location. Noble families, whose marriages had significant political implications, found their union subject to much more scrutiny than peasant marriages. A duke's daughter who claimed her marriage was invalid due to coercion might find her case heard by bishops or even the Pope himself. A peasant girl making the same claim was more likely to be told to accept her fate and make the best of it. What's particularly striking about medieval marriage law is how it attempted to balance competing interests: parental authority, church, doctrine, political necessity, and individual welfare, while operating under assumptions about childhood, gender, and sexuality that we now know to be deeply flawed. The legal framework wasn't designed to be cruel, but it was built on a foundation that prioritized social stability and reproduction over individual happiness or well-being. Understanding this legal context is crucial because it helps explain why practices that seem obviously harmful to modern eyes were not only tolerated but actively supported by the most learned and influential people of their time. These weren't ignorant barbarians making arbitrary rules. They were sophisticated legal minds, working within a worldview that simply didn't recognize childhood as we understand it today. If you thought all medieval 12-year-old brides faced the same challenges, think again. The difference between being married as a princess versus being married as a peasant's daughter was like the difference between starring in a royal pageant and being sold at a livestock market. Both were problematic by modern standards, but the resources, protections, and future prospects were worlds apart. Let's start with Princess Isabella of Valois, who was married to King Richard II of England in 1396 at the tender age of 6. Yes, 6, not 12. Her wedding was a spectacular affair that lasted 3 days, involved hundreds of guests, and cost more money than most people would see in several lifetimes. Meanwhile, that same year, countless peasant girls were being married off in simple ceremonies that might have involved a shared cup of ale and the local priest mumbling a few Latin phrases he half remembered. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. To be fair, Princess Isabella's marriage was delayed in its consummation until she was older, a luxury that reflected both her high status and the political importance of keeping her healthy for future childbearing. Royal marriages were investments that kingdoms couldn't afford to see ruined by premature pregnancy or death. Peasant marriages, on the other hand, were often consummated immediately because there was no grand political strategy to protect, and families needed the economic benefits of the union to start flowing right away. The preparation for marriage varied dramatically between social classes. Noble girls spent years learning what we might call executive skills: how to manage large households, oversee servants, handle correspondence, and navigate the complex political relationships that would define their married lives. They learned multiple languages, studied music and literature, and received instruction in everything from heraldry to accounting. If you thought modern helicopter parenting was intense, medieval noble families basically ran finishing schools, designed to produce the perfect political wife. Peasant girls, meanwhile, learned practical skills that would help them survive: cooking, brewing, textile production, animal husbandry, and basic medical care. Their education was entirely focused on immediate survival and economic productivity. While a noble girl might spend her morning learning to play the lute and her afternoon studying Latin, a peasant girl was more likely to spend her day learning to identify edible plants and figuring out how to make a single chicken feed a family of 6. The wedding ceremonies themselves reflected these class differences in every detail. Royal weddings were elaborate affairs that could involve multiple ceremonies, processions through city streets, and celebrations that lasted for weeks. Guest lists included foreign dignitaries, church officials, and representatives from allied kingdoms. The bride's dress might be worth more than entire villages, sewn with gold thread and decorated with precious stones that had been imported from distant lands. Meanwhile, a peasant bride was lucky if she had a clean dress that hadn't been patched multiple times. But here's where things get complicated. And this is crucial to understand. The elaborate nature of noble weddings wasn't necessarily better for the young brides involved. All that pageantry came with enormous pressure and scrutiny. Every aspect of a royal bride's behavior was analyzed for political implications. A 12-year-old princess who seemed unhappy at her wedding could trigger diplomatic incidents. Peasant brides, for all their lack of resources, at least had the luxury of relative privacy in their misery. The living arrangements after marriage also varied dramatically between social classes. Noble brides often moved into massive castles or palaces with hundreds of servants, elaborate gardens, and libraries filled with books. Sounds luxurious, right? Except these same castles were often cold, damp, and surprisingly uncomfortable. More importantly, noble wives were constantly surrounded by people, servants, courtiers, visitors, guards, which meant virtually no privacy and constant performance of their role as the perfect wife. Peasant brides, by contrast, typically moved into 1- or 2-room houses that they often shared with their husband's extended family. The living conditions were cramped and basic, but they offered something that noble wives rarely experienced: the possibility of genuine intimacy and authentic relationships with their spouses. Without the constant pressure of political performance, peasant couples had more opportunity to develop real partnerships based on mutual affection and shared struggles. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize peasant marriages. The harsh economic realities meant that these unions were also largely practical arrangements focused on survival. But the absence of political complications did create space for human connection in ways that weren't possible for their noble counterparts. Meanwhile, noble wives might go months without having a private conversation with their husbands, as their interactions were constantly mediated by the demands of court life and political necessity. The church's involvement actually made the matchmaking process even more complex. Now, families had to consider not just secular political implications, but also religious ones. Was the proposed spouse's family sufficiently orthodox? Had they been involved in any heretical movements? Did they have good relationships with local church authorities? A marriage that made perfect sense from a political and economic standpoint could be derailed if church officials disapproved. International matchmaking presented its own unique challenges. When marriages were being negotiated between families from different kingdoms, matchmakers had to navigate different legal systems, currency exchanges, and cultural expectations. A dowry negotiated in French currency might be worth significantly more or less by the time the actual wedding took place, depending on political and economic developments. Meanwhile, cultural differences in everything from wedding customs to household management could create conflicts that even the most experienced matchmakers struggled to anticipate. The rise of merchant families in the 14th and 15th centuries created new opportunities and challenges for matchmakers. These newly wealthy families had money but lacked noble bloodlines, while established noble families had prestigious names but sometimes lacked ready cash. Matchmakers who could successfully broker marriages between these groups found themselves in high demand, but they also had to navigate the social tensions between old aristocracy and new money. Women matchmakers faced particular challenges in this male-dominated field. They had to build and maintain business relationships with men who controlled family finances and political decisions, while also gaining the trust of women who would be directly affected by the marriages they arranged. Successful female matchmakers often developed reputations as wise counselors who understood both the practical necessities of advantageous marriages and the human costs of getting them wrong. The most skilled matchmakers learned to read between the lines of family communications and social interactions. They could spot financial difficulties that families were trying to hide, identify personality conflicts that might doom a marriage, and anticipate political developments that could affect their clients' prospects. Those who developed these skills could command enormous fees and influence, becoming trusted advisors to multiple generations of noble families. And yet, even the most successful matchmakers operated within a system that fundamentally prioritized family interests over individual welfare. A matchmaker might genuinely care about the happiness of the children whose marriages she arranged, but her professional success depended on satisfying parents who were primarily concerned with advancing their family's political and economic position. The emotional toll on matchmakers themselves is rarely discussed in historical sources, but it must have been significant. These women built careers around arranging marriages for children, knowing that many of these unions would result in misery, abuse, or early death. Some contemporary sources suggest that successful matchmakers developed a kind of professional detachment that allowed them to focus on the strategic aspects of their work while ignoring the human consequences. What emerges from studying medieval matchmaking is a picture of a profession that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more ruthless than most people realize. These weren't simple village busybodies, gossiping about eligible bachelors. They were skilled professionals, operating complex businesses that could determine the fates of kingdoms. The fact that children's welfare was often secondary to these larger considerations doesn't diminish the skill involved, but it does highlight just how different medieval priorities were from our own. Of course, no medieval institution could function without religious justification, and child marriage was no exception. The Catholic Church didn't just tolerate the practice of marrying off 12-year-old girls. It actively provided theological frameworks that made these unions seem not just acceptable, but divinely ordained. If you thought religious institutions were always protective of children, the medieval church's approach to marriage might come as an uncomfortable surprise. Let's be honest about the church's position. They argued that early marriage was actually protective of young people's souls. The logic went something like this. Unmarried young people were vulnerable to the sins of lust and fornication, so getting them married as soon as they reached physical maturity was actually a form of spiritual protection. That's right, the church argued that a 12-year-old girl was safer, married to a potentially abusive stranger, than she was remaining single and potentially tempted by sexual thoughts. The theological foundations for this position came from several sources, starting with the writings of St. Paul, who famously declared that it was better to marry than to burn with passion. Medieval theologians interpreted this to mean that marriage was primarily a remedy for sexual desire, rather than a partnership based on love or companionship. To be fair, Paul was writing to adult Christians in the 1st century, but medieval church authorities applied his teachings to children, without apparently considering whether 12-year-olds were experiencing the kind of mature sexual desire that Paul was addressing. St. Augustine's writings provided another pillar of support for early marriage. Augustine argued that marriage served 3 primary purposes: procreation, fidelity, and sacrament. The procreation aspect was considered so important that delaying marriage past the point of physical maturity was seen as potentially wasteful of God-given fertility. Meanwhile, the fidelity aspect suggested that early marriage prevented young people from developing sexual relationships outside of marriage, which were considered sinful regardless of the participants' ages. The Church's concept of consent was particularly problematic when applied to child marriages. Canon law required that both parties consent to marriage, which sounds progressive until you realize how they defined consent for minors. Church authorities argued that children could provide valid consent as long as they understood the basic nature of the marriage commitment, essentially, that they were agreeing to live together and have children. They didn't require emotional maturity, life experience, or genuine freedom to choose alternatives. And yet, The church did provide some protections that secular authorities often ignored. Canon law prohibited marriages between children who were too closely related, forbade forced marriages, at least in theory, and required that unions be blessed by ordained priests. These requirements created procedural hurdles that could sometimes be used to delay or prevent particularly problematic marriages. Though enforcement was inconsistent at best. By the 12th century, influential theologians like Thomas Aquinas were beginning to develop more sophisticated theories about marriage and consent. Aquinas argued that true marriage required not just physical compatibility, but also intellectual and emotional partnership. Still, when it came to determining the minimum age for these partnerships, he largely accepted the existing canonical ages of 12 for girls and 14 for boys, arguing that these were the ages when children typically developed sufficient reasoning ability to understand their commitments. The Church's emphasis on marriage as a sacrament created additional complications. If marriage was truly a sacred act blessed by God, then questioning the appropriateness of child marriage could be seen as questioning God's wisdom. This theological framework made it extremely difficult for critics to argue against early marriage without appearing to challenge fundamental church doctrine. Sound familiar? It's the same logical trap that's been used to defend problematic practices throughout history. Wrap them in religious language, and suddenly, criticism becomes blasphemy. Meanwhile, the Church's own practices often contradicted its stated principles. While canon law theoretically required consent from both parties, Church officials regularly blessed marriages where one or both parties were clearly unwilling participants. When political alliances were at stake, Church authorities proved remarkably flexible in their interpretation of consent requirements. A 12-year-old girl's tears during her wedding ceremony might be dismissed as natural nervousness rather than evidence of coercion. The development of canon law regarding marriage was heavily influenced by political considerations. The Church was constantly negotiating with secular authorities who wanted religious legitimacy for their dynastic marriages. Church leaders who took too hard a line against child marriage might find themselves in conflict with the very noble families who provided financial support and political protection for church institutions. Religious justifications for child marriage also drew on biblical precedents that seemed deeply problematic to modern readers. Church authorities pointed to figures like Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was traditionally believed to have been quite young when she was betrothed to Joseph. They also referenced Old Testament practices where young girls were given in marriage as part of tribal alliances. Of course, applying ancient Middle Eastern customs to medieval European society required considerable interpretive creativity, but medieval theologians were remarkably skilled at finding religious justification for practices that served contemporary political needs. The Church's approach to sexual morality created particularly twisted logic around child marriage. Since sexual activity outside of marriage was considered sinful, and since children were believed to become capable of sexual desire at 12 for girls or 14 for boys, the logical conclusion was that marriage at these ages was not just permissible, but necessary for spiritual health. The possibility that children might not be ready for sexual activity, regardless of their marital status, apparently didn't factor into these theological calculations. Monasteries and convents provided an alternative to marriage that some families used strategically. Parents who couldn't arrange advantageous marriages for their daughters might place them in religious communities instead, where they would be married to Christ rather than to human husbands. Still, this alternative was often just as involuntary as secular marriage, and girls who were placed in convents against their will had even fewer options for escape than those in difficult marriages. The Church's teaching on the indissolubility of marriage created additional problems for child brides. while secular authorities might occasionally allow divorces for political reasons, the church maintained that valid marriages could only be ended by death. This meant that a girl married at 12 was theoretically bound to her husband for life, regardless of how the relationship developed. Annulment was possible under very specific circumstances, but obtaining one required navigating complex church bureaucracy and often involved substantial financial costs. Different religious orders and regional church authorities sometimes took varying approaches to child marriage, creating a patchwork of practices across medieval Europe. Some monastic communities developed reputations for being more protective of young people, while others were known to be more accommodating to noble families seeking religious blessing for problematic marriages. This inconsistency meant that a family's religious connections could significantly influence their daughter's marriage prospects. The church's involvement in marriage also created opportunities for corruption. Wealthy families could purchase dispensations that allowed them to circumvent normal canonical requirements, while poor families were held to stricter standards. A noble family might obtain permission to marry their 12-year-old daughter to a close relative, while peasant families were denied similar accommodations. The gap between church doctrine and church practice was often bridged by financial contributions. What's particularly striking about the church's approach to child marriage is how it combined genuine theological reasoning with obvious political pragmatism. Church authorities weren't simply cynical politicians, blessing whatever marriages served their interests. Many genuinely believed they were implementing God's will as they understood it. But their understanding was heavily shaped by the social and political context in which they operated, leading to theological positions that seem obviously problematic to modern observers. The long-term consequences of the church's position on child marriage extended far beyond individual families. By providing religious legitimacy for these practices, church authorities helped create cultural norms that persisted for centuries. Even as social and economic conditions changed, the theological frameworks developed to justify child marriage continued to influence Christian thinking about childhood, sexuality, and family relationships. Meanwhile, let's address the elephant in the medieval bedchamber. What actually happened on wedding nights when one or both parties were children, who had received essentially no preparation for sexual intimacy? If you thought modern sex education was inadequate, medieval preparation for marital relations was basically non-existent, combining dangerous ignorance with harmful misconceptions that could traumatize young people for life. Let's be clear about it. The level of sexual ignorance that was considered normal and even virtuous in medieval society. Girls were typically told nothing about sexual relations, beyond vague references to their marital duties, and the expectation that they should submit to their husband's wishes without question. That's right, 12-year-old brides were expected to navigate one of the most complex and potentially traumatic aspects of adult life with no guidance beyond do what your husband tells you. The church's teaching on sexuality made this ignorance even more problematic. Medieval theologians taught that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, was potentially sinful, especially for women. The proper approach to marital relations was supposed to be dutiful and procreative, with minimal enjoyment on either side. This created a psychological framework where young brides were supposed to submit to experiences they didn't understand, weren't supposed to enjoy, but were expected to endure for the rest of their lives. That, to be fair, some mothers did attempt to prepare their daughters for marriage, but these conversations were typically limited to warnings about pain and advice about endurance, rather than actual information about anatomy or sexual health. A typical maternal preparation might consist of something like, "It will hurt at first, but you'll get used to it, and your job is to give your husband sons." Sound familiar? Unfortunately, variations of this advice persisted well into the modern era. The medical understanding of female sexuality was not just limited but actively harmful. Medieval physicians believed that women's bodies were essentially defective versions of men's bodies, and that female sexual organs were simply internal versions of male genitalia. This led to fundamental misunderstandings about everything from arousal to conception, creating a framework where normal female sexual responses were pathologized or ignored entirely. Meanwhile, boys received little better preparation, though. Their ignorance was often considered less problematic since they were expected to take the active role in sexual relations. Young husbands might have some basic understanding of the mechanics involved, often gleaned from conversations with older male relatives or observations of animal breeding. But they typically had no concept of female pleasure, consent, or emotional aspects of intimacy. The physical realities of wedding nights involving child brides were often brutal. A 12-year-old girl's body, even if she had reached menarche, was typically not fully developed enough for safe sexual activity. Medieval people had no understanding of the continued physical development that occurs throughout adolescence, or the increased risks associated with early pregnancy and childbirth. They operated under the assumption that menstruation meant full physical readiness for all aspects of adult sexuality. Of course, the lack of understanding about contraception meant that pregnancy was an immediate possibility from the wedding night forward. Medieval people had various folk methods for preventing pregnancy, many of which were ineffective and some of which were actively dangerous. But young brides rarely had access to this information or the autonomy to use it. Even if they did, the expectation was that wives would begin producing children as quickly as possible, regardless of their physical or emotional readiness. The privacy customs surrounding wedding nights varied significantly by social class, but none of them were designed with the welfare of young brides in mind. In noble families, wedding nights were often semi-public affairs where family members and witnesses would verify that the marriage had been consummated. Imagine being a frightened 12-year-old girl, dealing with an unfamiliar and potentially painful experience while knowing that people were waiting outside your bedroom door for proof that it had happened. Peasant families typically afforded more privacy, but they also provided less support. Young peasant brides might be left entirely alone with husbands they barely knew, in houses where thin walls meant that any sounds of distress would be heard by extended family members who were unlikely to intervene. The assumption was that marital relations were private matters between husband and wife, regardless of the ages involved. And yet, some medieval sources suggest that not all wedding nights involving young brides were immediately consummated, particularly in cases where the bride was very young or obviously unprepared. Some husbands chose to delay sexual relations until their wives were older or more comfortable. This wasn't necessarily out of kindness. Sometimes it reflected practical concerns about the bride's health or the husband's own discomfort with the situation. The church's position on wedding night activities was characteristically contradictory. While church authorities insisted that consummation was necessary to make marriages legally binding, they also taught that sexual activity should be moderate and focused on procreation rather than pleasure. This created confusion about how often married couples should engage in sexual relations and what behaviors were acceptable within marriage. Medieval marriage manuals, the few that existed, were typically written by church authorities and focused more on spiritual guidance than practical advice. These texts might discuss the importance of marital fidelity and the husband's responsibility to be gentle with his wife, but they rarely provided specific information about anatomy, sexual technique, or how to address problems that might arise. The lack of medical knowledge meant that wedding night injuries or complications were often attributed to moral failings rather than physical problems. A young bride who experienced pain or bleeding might be told that this was normal punishment for the sin of sexuality, while a bride who failed to conceive quickly might be blamed for spiritual inadequacy rather than physical immaturity. Still, some evidence suggests that medieval people were gradually developing more sophisticated understandings of sexuality and marriage. By the 14th and 15th centuries, some medical texts were beginning to acknowledge that female sexual satisfaction might be important for conception, leading to advice that husbands should try to please their wives rather than simply using them. For reproduction, the psychological impact of traumatic wedding nights on young brides is difficult to assess from historical sources, since women rarely had opportunities to record their personal experiences. But letters, diary entries, and other personal documents that have survived suggest that many young wives struggled with fear, pain, and confusion that affected their relationships with their husbands for years or even decades. The development of romantic literature in the later medieval period began to introduce ideas about love and mutual affection within marriage, but these ideals rarely extended to discussions of sexual relations. Courtly romance focused on emotional and spiritual connection, while largely ignoring the physical realities of married life, creating unrealistic expectations that may have made the gap between ideal and reality even more painful for young brides. Some families attempted to ease the transition by arranging for experienced women to provide guidance to young brides, but this support was informal and varied widely in quality. A young bride might receive helpful practical advice from a sympathetic older female relative, or she might be given misinformation and harmful counsel from women who had themselves been traumatized by their own experiences. The economic pressure to produce children quickly meant that young wives who experienced difficulties with sexual relations couldn't simply avoid the issue. Marriages that weren't producing heirs were considered failures, and wives were typically blamed regardless of the actual cause of fertility problems. This created additional psychological pressure on young brides who were already struggling with unfamiliar and potentially frightening experiences. What emerges from examining medieval wedding nights is a picture of young people, particularly young women, being thrust into adult situations without adequate preparation, support, or understanding. The combination of sexual ignorance, harmful medical beliefs, and social pressure created conditions where trauma was almost inevitable. Yet these experiences were considered normal and necessary parts of life. The long-term consequences of these traumatic beginnings often shaped entire marriages and families. Young wives who experience sexual trauma on their wedding nights might never develop comfortable, healthy relationships with their husbands, affecting not only their own well-being, but also their ability to provide emotional support and guidance to their own children when they reached marriageable age. And yet, if you thought the wedding night was the most dangerous part of being a child bride, think again. The real life or death stakes came with pregnancy and childbirth, where 12 and 13-year-old girls face mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. We're talking about a world where becoming pregnant as a young teenager wasn't just emotionally traumatic. It was often literally a death sentence. Let's be honest about the numbers, because they're genuinely shocking. Maternal mortality rates for girls under 15 were estimated to be anywhere from 10 to 20% in medieval Europe, meaning that 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 young mothers died in childbirth or from pregnancy-related complications. To put that in perspective, modern maternal mortality rates in developed countries are less than 0.02%. That's right. Medieval child brides were roughly 500 to 1,000 times more likely to die from pregnancy than modern women. The medical understanding of pregnancy and childbirth was not just primitive, but actively dangerous. Medieval physicians believed that younger mothers were actually preferable because their bodies were supposedly more flexible and adaptable. They had no concept of the fact that adolescent girls' pelvises aren't fully developed until their late teens or the teenage. Pregnancy carries significantly higher risks for both mother and child. If you thought medieval medicine was generally backward, their approach to obstetrics was particularly deadly. To be fair, medieval midwives often had more practical knowledge than university-trained physicians, since they actually attended births. While male doctors typically only got involved when things went catastrophically wrong, experienced midwives understood positioning, timing, and some basic interventions that could help during difficult labors. Still, they were working without any understanding of infection control, anatomy, or the warning signs of serious complications. Church's teaching on pregnancy and childbirth created additional psychological burdens for young mothers. Church authorities taught that the pain of childbirth was punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, and that good Christian women should endure this suffering without complaint. Pain relief was often considered spiritually suspect, since it might interfere with God's plan for women to suffer during delivery. Meanwhile, young girls who cried out during labor might be criticized for lacking proper Christian fortitude. Of course, the pressure to produce male heirs meant that pregnancy was just the beginning of the ordeal. Young wives who gave birth to daughters faced immediate pressure to conceive again, often before their bodies had recovered from previous pregnancies. Families would typically wait only long enough to determine whether the mother was likely to survive, then begin encouraging the couple to try for a son. The concept of spacing pregnancies for health reasons was virtually unknown. The nutritional challenges facing young mothers were particularly severe. Medieval diets were often inadequate, even for adults, and pregnant teenagers needed additional calories and nutrients that weren't available to most families. Young mothers from peasant families might be malnourished throughout their pregnancies, while even noble families didn't understand the dietary requirements for healthy fetal development. Infant mortality rates were also devastating, with roughly 30 to 40% of babies dying before their first birthday. For young mothers who had survived the trauma of childbirth, losing their babies was both emotionally devastating and practically problematic, since it meant they had endured the risks of pregnancy without producing the heir that justified the entire arrangement. Many young mothers face pressure to conceive again immediately after infant deaths, creating cycles of pregnancy, loss, and trauma that could continue for years. And yet, successful childbirth did offer young wives a form of protection and status that they couldn't achieve any other way. Mothers, especially mothers of sons, had greater security within their marriages and more influence within their households. A 13-year-old girl who successfully delivered a healthy son might find herself with significantly more autonomy and respect than her unmarried sisters. Despite her youth, the birthing process itself was exclusively a female domain, which created one of the few spaces in medieval society where women had complete authority. During labor and delivery, even the most powerful husbands were excluded from the birthing chamber, and experienced women took charge of the situation. For young mothers, this meant being surrounded by older women who understood their experience in ways that their husbands and male relatives never could. Still, this female solidarity came with its own problems. The older women attending births often had their own histories of trauma and loss that could influence their approach to helping younger mothers. Traditional practices that were supposed to ease labor, like herbal preparations or positioning techniques, were sometimes based on superstition rather than medical knowledge, and could occasionally make situations worse rather than better. The lack of understanding about infection meant that childbirth often led to deadly complications that seemed mysterious to medieval people. Puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infections during or after delivery, killed thousands of women who had survived the actual birth process. Medieval people attributed these deaths to everything from moral failings to supernatural curses, since they had no concept of bacterial contamination or antiseptic practices. By the 13th century, Some medical texts were beginning to acknowledge that very young mothers face special risks, but this knowledge was slow to translate into practical changes. University-trained physicians might understand theoretically that 12-year-old mothers were more likely to experience complications, but they rarely had the authority to delay marriages or pregnancies based on medical concerns. The development of more sophisticated surgical techniques did offer some hope for mothers experiencing obstructed labor, but these interventions were dangerous and often fatal themselves. Caesarean sections were occasionally performed when mothers were already dying, but the procedure was almost always fatal to the mother and rarely successful in saving the baby. The few women who survived surgical interventions were often left with disabilities that affected their ability to care for future children. Meanwhile, the emotional support available to young mothers varied dramatically by social class and family circumstances. Noble mothers might have access to networks of other women who could provide advice and comfort, while peasant mothers often faced their ordeals with minimal support. The isolation that many young wives experienced made pregnancy and childbirth even more frightening than they needed to be. The economic implications of pregnancy complications were severe for families at every social level. A young wife who died in childbirth represented not just personal tragedy, but significant financial loss, since her family had typically paid a substantial dowry for the marriage. Families who lost daughters to childbirth might struggle to arrange marriages for remaining daughters, since they had fewer resources for dowries and potential in-laws might question their family's health history. Some evidence suggests that families occasionally tried to delay pregnancies for very young brides, either by delaying consummation or by using folk contraceptive methods. But these efforts were often undermined by social pressure to produce heirs quickly and by the lack of reliable contraceptive techniques. Most families operated under the assumption that pregnancy was inevitable and that early motherhood was simply a natural part of life. The psychological impact of repeated pregnancies on young mothers is difficult to assess from historical sources, but contemporary accounts suggest that many women developed fatalistic attitudes toward childbirth. That helped them cope with repeated trauma. The expectation that motherhood would involve significant suffering may have helped some women endure experiences that would be considered traumatic by modern standards. What's particularly striking about medieval approaches to pregnancy and childbirth is how the combination of medical ignorance and social pressure created a system where young girls were routinely exposed to life-threatening situations that could have been avoided with better understanding and different priorities. The medieval world wasn't intentionally cruel to young mothers, but their practices were based on assumptions about female biology and social necessity that proved deadly for thousands of women. The long-term health consequences for young mothers who survived multiple pregnancies were often severe. Women who began childbearing in their early teens and continued having children throughout their fertile years frequently suffered from what we would now recognize as chronic health problems related to repeated pregnancies, inadequate nutrition, and lack of medical care. Still, let's talk about what happened after the wedding ceremonies ended and the immediate crisis of early pregnancy was navigated. The daily reality of being a married child in medieval society. We're talking about 12 and 13-year-old girls who were expected to manage complex households, supervise adult servants, handle financial decisions, and represent their families in social and business situations while still being children themselves in many fundamental ways. The scope of responsibilities placed on young wives varied dramatically by social class, but even peasant brides found themselves managing tasks that would challenge modern adults. A noble 12-year-old might be responsible for overseeing the daily operations of a castle with hundreds of inhabitants, managing food stores for an entire community, coordinating with suppliers and merchants, and ensuring that visiting dignitaries were properly entertained. Meanwhile, She might still be learning basic literacy skills or struggling with arithmetic that was essential for household accounting. To be fair, young wives typically had experienced servants and advisors to help them learn these responsibilities, but the ultimate accountability rested on their shoulders. A noble bride who mismanaged her household could create diplomatic incidents, financial crises, or social embarrassments that affected her family's reputation for generations. If you thought modern teenagers had pressure, imagine being personally responsible for the economic welfare of hundreds of people while still figuring out basic life skills yourself. The educational challenges were particularly complex. Many young brides were still receiving instruction in literacy, languages, and arithmetic, while simultaneously learning to manage adult responsibilities. A 13-year-old might spend her morning struggling with Latin lessons, then spend her afternoon negotiating with merchants about grain purchases for the winter. The cognitive demands of switching between childhood, learning, and adult decision-making must have been exhausting. Let's be honest about the social dynamics involved. Young wives often found themselves managing servants who were older, more experienced, and more knowledgeable than they were. Maintaining authority over adults while still being a child required delicate navigation of respect, firmness, and humility. Servants who had worked for a family for decades might resent taking orders from a 12-year-old girl, even if she was technically their mistress. Of course, the most successful young wives learned to leverage the knowledge and experience of their servants rather than trying to assert authority through confrontation. A wise young bride might present herself as eager to learn from experienced staff, while making it clear that final decisions rested with her. This approach could create collaborative relationships that benefited everyone involved, but it required emotional intelligence that many adults struggled to develop. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created constantly changing demands on household management. Young wives had to understand agricultural cycles, plan for food preservation during harvest season, manage heating and lighting during winter months, and coordinate with other households for major celebrations and events. A mistake in timing, like failing to order enough firewood before winter or miscalculating food needs during a siege, could have deadly consequences. Meanwhile, the social obligations of married women required young wives to develop sophisticated diplomatic skills. They were expected to maintain relationships with other noble families, mediate disputes between household members, represent their husband's interests in business negotiations, and navigate the complex etiquette requirements of medieval court life. A social misstep could damage family alliances or create enemies that might cause problems for decades. The financial responsibilities were particularly daunting. Young wives might be managing budgets that involved multiple currencies, complex credit arrangements, and seasonal fluctuations in prices and availability. They needed to understand the relative values of different goods, anticipate market changes, and make purchasing decisions that balanced immediate needs with long-term planning. And yet, they were doing this with mathematical educations that were often rudimentary at best. And yet, despite these overwhelming responsibilities, young wives were still children in many ways. Contemporary sources describe noble girls playing with dolls, enjoying simple games, and displaying emotional immaturity even while managing complex adult tasks. The psychological stress of this dual existence, being simultaneously child and adult, student and teacher, dependent and authority figure, must have been enormous. The isolation experienced by many young wives compounded these challenges. Marriage often meant leaving their birth families and moving to unfamiliar locations where they knew few people. A 12-year-old bride might find herself the only person of her age and background in an entire household, surrounded by adults who viewed her primarily in terms of her functional responsibilities rather than her personal needs. Some young wives found creative ways to maintain connections to childhood while fulfilling adult obligations. They might arrange for younger children in their households to play games with them, commission toys or entertainments that serve both personal and household functions, or maintain correspondence with sisters or friends who were still unmarried. These adaptations show remarkable resilience and creativity in dealing with impossible situations. The relationship dynamics with husbands added another layer of complexity to daily life. Young wives had to navigate relationships with men who were often significantly older and more experienced, while maintaining appropriate deference and respect. A 12-year-old bride, married to a 30-year-old husband, was dealing with someone who had twice her life experience and significantly more knowledge about the world. Yet she was expected to be his partner in managing their shared interests. Still, some evidence suggests that marriages involving very young wives sometimes developed into genuinely affectionate partnerships over time. Husbands who were patient and supportive during their wives' adjustment periods might find themselves with loyal and capable partners as the girls matured. The shared experience of building a household and raising children together could create strong bonds. Even when the initial marriage had been purely practical, the health challenges facing young wives were constant and serious. The combination of poor nutrition, frequent pregnancies, limited medical care, and high stress levels created conditions where illness and injury were common. Young wives had to manage their households while dealing with their own health problems, and they often lacked the authority to prioritize their own welfare over their family's needs. By the 14th century, some families were beginning to provide more structured support for young wives during their adjustment periods. Mothers or other female relatives might remain in the household for extended periods after weddings, helping young brides learn their new responsibilities gradually rather than expecting immediate competence. This trend suggests growing recognition that 12-year-old wives needed additional support, even if the basic practice of child marriage continued. The development of written household management guides during the later medieval period provides insight into the scope of responsibilities expected from young wives. These texts covered everything from food preservation techniques to diplomatic protocol, suggesting that medieval people understood the complexity of household management, even if they didn't question the appropriateness of assigning these tasks to children. The long-term psychological effects of managing adult responsibilities during childhood are difficult to assess from historical sources, but some patterns emerge. Young wives who successfully navigated their early responsibilities often developed remarkable competence and confidence that served them well throughout their lives. Others seem to have been overwhelmed by the demands placed on them, leading to ongoing difficulties with decision-making and authority. What emerges from examining the daily lives of child brides is a picture of remarkable resilience and adaptation in the face of impossible circumstances. These young women found ways to fulfill adult responsibilities while maintaining their humanity and, in some cases, even their childhood joy. The fact that many succeeded doesn't make the system less problematic, but it does highlight the extraordinary capabilities that humans can develop when circumstances demand it. The social support networks that developed around young wives were crucial to their success. Experienced women in their communities often provided informal mentorship and guidance, creating systems of knowledge transfer that helped young brides learn essential skills. These networks operated largely outside formal authority structures, representing a form of female solidarity that transcended age and social boundaries. Meanwhile, let's address one of the most heartbreaking aspects of medieval child marriage. What happened when young people actually fell in love, either with someone other than their arranged spouse or, perhaps even more tragically, when they tried to find love within marriages that had been designed purely for political and economic purposes? If you thought medieval people were emotionally cold and purely practical about relationships, The historical record tells a very different and much more complex story. The concept of romantic love wasn't unknown in medieval society, quite the opposite, actually. The tradition of courtly love that developed in the 12th century celebrated passionate, idealized romantic relationships that were supposed to ennoble and inspire both participants. The problem was that these romantic ideals were specifically designed to exist outside of marriage, creating a cultural framework where love and marriage were seen as fundamentally incompatible institutions. Let's be clear about what this meant. In practice, young people were surrounded by stories, songs, and poems celebrating passionate love affairs, while simultaneously being told that their own marriages should be based on duty, obligation, and family loyalty rather than personal affection. That's right. Medieval culture essentially taught young people to desire something they could never legitimately have within the confines of their arranged marriages. To be fair, some medieval thinkers did argue that love could and should develop within marriage over time. These writers suggested that shared experiences, mutual respect, and physical intimacy could eventually create affectionate bonds between spouses who had started as strangers. While this wasn't the passionate, consuming love celebrated in romantic literature, it was presented as a more stable and sustainable foundation for long-term partnerships. The reality, of course, was much more complicated. Some young people did manage to develop genuine affection for their arranged spouses, particularly when both parties were patient, kind, and committed to making the relationship work. Age differences, personality conflicts, and plain incompatibility made this outcome far from guaranteed, but it wasn't impossible. Contemporary sources describe marriages that began as purely practical arrangements but evolved into partnerships that included real mutual affection and even passion. Of course, the development of love within arranged marriages required time, maturity, and favorable circumstances that weren't always available. A 12-year-old bride married to an abusive or indifferent husband had little opportunity to develop positive feelings about her situation, regardless of her natural inclinations toward affection and partnership. Meanwhile, husbands who viewed their young wives purely as breeding stock or political assets rarely provided the emotional support necessary for love to flourish. The tragic cases of young people who fell in love with someone other than their intended or actual spouses provide some of the most poignant stories in medieval literature and historical records. We're talking about teenagers who experienced the full intensity of first love, only to be told that their feelings were irrelevant compared to family obligations and political necessities. Sound familiar? The conflict between individual desires and social expectations is a theme that resonates across centuries. Some young people attempted to resist unwanted marriages by declaring their love for someone else, but these protests were rarely effective and often made their situations worse. Parents who discovered that their daughters had romantic attachments to inappropriate suitors might accelerate marriage arrangements to prevent further complications. A girl who had been scheduled to marry at 14 might find herself married at 12 if her family suspected she was developing feelings for someone else. And yet, the medieval period also produced some remarkable stories of young people who successfully challenged their family's marriage plans. These cases typically involved individuals with unusual personal resources, exceptional beauty, intelligence, or connections that gave them leverage in negotiations with their families. A duke's daughter who was beloved by multiple suitors might be able to express preferences among her options, even if she couldn't reject marriage entirely. The Church's teaching on marriage created additional complications for young people navigating between love and duty. While church authorities insisted that marriage required consent from both parties, they also taught that romantic passion was potentially dangerous and that marriages based on spiritual compatibility and mutual respect were preferable to those based on physical attraction or emotional intensity. By the 13th century, some church authorities were beginning to argue that mutual affection between spouses was not only acceptable but desirable, since it made couples more likely to fulfill their marital obligations willingly rather than grudgingly. This represented a significant shift from earlier teachings that viewed any strong emotions between spouses as potentially problematic, but it still didn't extend to accepting marriages based purely on romantic attraction. The development of letter writing as a means of communication created new opportunities for young people to express their feelings about marriage arrangements. Some of the most moving documents from the medieval period are letters from young women pleading with parents to reconsider unwanted marriages, or from young men trying to convince families to accept their romantic choices. These letters reveal the emotional sophistication and articulate reasoning that medieval young people were capable of, even when their arguments ultimately failed to change their circumstances. Still, we shouldn't romanticize the medieval period's approach to love and marriage. For every story of successful romantic resistance, there were dozens of cases where young people's feelings were completely ignored or actively suppressed. The power dynamics involved in medieval families meant that children's emotional welfare was almost always subordinated to broader family interests, regardless of how eloquently they might argue for their personal preferences. The intersection of love and duty played out differently across social classes. Noble families, whose marriages had significant political implications, are generally less tolerant of romantic complications than merchant or peasant families. A peasant's daughter might have slightly more opportunity to express preferences among her suitors, since the political stakes were lower, but she still had very limited control over her ultimate fate. Meanwhile, the economic realities of medieval life meant that even families who were sympathetic to their children's romantic feelings often felt they couldn't afford to prioritize love over practical considerations. A family that allowed their daughter to marry for love rather than financial advantage might find themselves unable to provide dowries for younger daughters or to maintain their social status within their communities. The psychological impact of being forced to abandon romantic attachments in favor of arranged marriages was often severe and long-lasting. Young people who had experienced the intensity of first love, only to have it denied or forbidden, sometimes struggled to develop emotional connections with their arranged spouses. The memory of what they had lost could make it difficult to appreciate what they had gained, even when their marriages were objectively successful. Some young wives found ways to maintain emotional connections to their romantic ideals even within practical marriages. They might correspond with poets or musicians who represented romantic possibilities, commission romantic literature or art, or cultivate friendships that provided emotional satisfaction without crossing the boundaries of marital fidelity. These adaptations required considerable emotional sophistication and careful navigation of social expectations. The rare cases where love and duty coincided, where young people fell in love with someone who was also an appropriate marriage partner, were celebrated in medieval literature as examples of divine providence or exceptional good fortune. These stories served as fantasy fulfillment for audiences who knew that most people couldn't expect such happy coincidences in their own lives. The development of more sophisticated ideas about marriage during the later medieval period began to create space for considering emotional compatibility alongside practical considerations. Some families started taking their children's preferences into account when evaluating potential spouses, even if they didn't allow complete freedom of choice. This trend represented a gradual shift toward recognizing that successful marriages required some level of mutual affection and respect. What emerges from examining the intersection of love and duty in medieval marriage is a picture of young people who were just as capable of deep emotion and romantic attachment as their modern counterparts, but who lived within social systems that rarely allowed them to act on these feelings. The tension between individual desires and family obligations created emotional conflicts that could last entire lifetimes. The survival of so many literary works exploring themes of forbidden love and romantic tragedy suggests that medieval audiences deeply identified with these conflicts. People who were living within arranged marriages found emotional release and validation in stories that acknowledged the power of romantic love, even when those stories ended tragically. This literature served as a form of collective therapy. For societies that required individuals to sacrifice personal happiness for larger social goals. Of course, not every medieval girl went quietly into arranged marriage. Despite the overwhelming social, economic, and legal pressures supporting child marriage, some young women found ways to resist, rebel, or at least complicate their families' plans. If you thought medieval girls were passive victims who accepted their fates without protest, the historical record reveals a surprising number of creative, determined, and sometimes successful acts of resistance that challenge our assumptions about medieval gender roles and family dynamics. Let's be honest about the courage required for these acts of rebellion. We're talking about children challenging systems that had the full backing of church, state, and family authority. A 12-year-old girl who refused an arranged marriage wasn't just defying her parents, she was challenging fundamental assumptions about gender, authority, and social order that were considered divinely ordained. That's right. Saying no to an unwanted marriage was essentially an act of revolutionary thinking that could brand a girl as dangerous to the entire social system. The most direct form of resistance was simply refusing to consent to marriage. During the ceremony itself, since canon law required consent from both parties, a bride who publicly declared her unwillingness could theoretically invalidate the entire proceedings. To be fair, this tactic rarely worked in practice, since families had numerous ways to pressure reluctant daughters into eventual compliance. But it did create public embarrassment and legal complications that sometimes forced renegotiation of marriage terms. Some of the most dramatic recorded cases involve young women who fled from their families rather than submit to unwanted marriages. These runaways faced enormous practical challenges. Medieval society offered few safe spaces for unaccompanied young women, and most communities would return runaway daughters to their families rather than harbor them. Still, some managed to find sanctuary in convents with sympathetic relatives, or occasionally with romantic partners who were willing to risk serious legal consequences to protect them. Meanwhile, other young women chose more subtle forms of resistance that were harder for their families to counter directly. Some claimed to have received religious visions directing them to remain unmarried, using their family's piety against their marriage plans. Others developed mysterious illnesses that made them unsuitable for marriage, though maintaining this deception required considerable acting skills and often involved real physical suffering. And yet, perhaps the most sophisticated form of resistance involved young women who learned to manipulate the marriage market itself. A particularly clever girl might encourage multiple suitors to compete for her hand, creating bidding wars that improved her marriage terms or allowed her to exercise some choice among her options. This strategy required considerable social intelligence, and often the covert support of sympathetic family members, but it could be remarkably effective. The church's requirement for consent created opportunities for resistance that some young women learned to exploit skillfully. A bride could claim that she had been coerced into agreement, that she didn't understand the nature of the marriage commitment, or that she had made her consent conditional on terms that weren't being met. These legal challenges rarely succeeded completely, but they could delay marriages and sometimes force families to make concessions. Some young women found allies among female relatives who remembered their own struggles with arranged marriages. Sympathetic aunts, older sisters, or even mothers sometimes provided covert support for resistance efforts, either by actively helping with escape plans or by working behind the scenes to improve marriage arrangements. These female networks operated largely outside official family hierarchies. Representing a form of gender solidarity that transcended generational boundaries. Of course, the consequences of failed resistance attempts could be severe. Families whose daughters proved difficult to marry off might resort to increasingly harsh measures to force compliance. Some sent rebellious daughters to convents against their will, while others essentially imprisoned them until they agreed to proposed marriages. The most extreme cases involve physical punishment or public humiliation designed to break young women's resistance. Still, successful resistance was possible, particularly for young women who had unusual resources or circumstances working in their favor. Daughters of wealthy families sometimes had access to independent financial resources that gave them leverage in negotiations with their parents. Others had political connections or unusual skills that made them valuable enough to have some say in their own fate. The development of romantic literature provided some young women with vocabulary and concepts for articulating their resistance to unwanted marriages. Stories of heroic young women who chose love over duty or who successfully challenged unjust authority gave real-world rebels models for their own behavior and arguments for their position. Literature didn't just reflect social reality. It helped shape it by providing alternatives to accepted norms. By the 14th century, some families were beginning to recognize that forcing extremely reluctant daughters into marriage often created more problems than it solved. Unhappy wives could make their husbands' lives miserable, damage family reputations through their behavior, or even attempt suicide or murder. Some parents started taking their daughters' strong objections more seriously, not out of respect for their autonomy, but out of practical concerns about the consequences of forcing unwanted marriages. The rise of merchant families created new dynamics around marriage resistance. Unlike noble families, whose marriages had clear political implications, merchant families sometimes had more flexibility in their marriage strategies. A merchant's daughter who successfully resisted one marriage proposal might find her family willing to consider alternative arrangements that better suited her preferences, particularly if she could demonstrate the practical benefits of her choices. Legal records from various medieval jurisdictions reveal surprising numbers of marriage disputes involving young women who challenged their families' arrangements. While most of these cases ultimately resulted in forced compliance with family wishes, the mere fact that they reached formal legal proceedings suggests that resistance was more common than traditional narratives suggest. These legal challenges also created precedents that occasionally benefited other young women in similar situations. Meanwhile, some young women found ways to negotiate better terms within arranged marriages rather than rejecting them entirely. A girl who couldn't avoid marriage altogether might be able to secure promises about household management authority, child-rearing decisions, or relationships with her birth family. These negotiations required sophisticated understanding of marriage law and family dynamics, but they could significantly improve the quality of young women's lives within their marriages. The most tragic cases of resistance involved young women who chose death over forced marriage. While suicide was considered a mortal sin by the church, some desperate girls preferred eternal damnation to lives they found unbearable. These extreme cases rarely changed family attitudes toward arranged marriage in general, but they sometimes prompted specific families to reconsider their approach to particularly unwilling daughters. Some resistance efforts were supported by romantic partners who were willing to risk everything to help their beloved avoid unwanted marriages. These cases often involved elaborate escape plans, secret ceremonies, or attempts to present families with fait accompli marriages that couldn't be easily undone. While romantic rescues make for compelling stories, they rarely succeeded in medieval reality due to the legal and economic power that families wielded over their daughters. The geographical mobility available to some medieval people created opportunities for resistance that wouldn't have existed in more static societies. Young women who could reach distant cities, foreign kingdoms, or frontier areas might find communities willing to accept them without scrutinizing their family backgrounds too closely. These escape routes required considerable courage and resources, but they offered genuine alternatives to unwanted marriages for the few who could access them. Religious communities provided another avenue for resistance, though one that came with its own significant constraints. Young women who claimed religious vocations could sometimes avoid secular marriage, but they faced the challenge of convincing skeptical families and church authorities that their calling was genuine rather than simply a convenient escape from unwanted spouses. Some families were willing to accept religious life for daughters who proved absolutely resistant to marriage, particularly if it allowed them to avoid public scandals. The economic calculations surrounding dowries sometimes worked in favor of resistant daughters. Families who had invested significant resources in marriage negotiations might be reluctant to abandon those investments, but they also couldn't afford to maintain unmarried daughters indefinitely. Young women who could demonstrate that their resistance was absolute sometimes forced their families to seek alternative arrangements rather than continuing costly and unsuccessful marriage campaigns. What emerges from studying medieval resistance to child marriage is a picture of young women who were far more active in shaping their own destinies than traditional historical narratives suggest. While most faced overwhelming pressures that ultimately forced compliance with family wishes, enough succeeded in changing their circumstances to demonstrate that resistance was possible and sometimes effective. The survival of stories about successful resistance in medieval literature and historical records suggests that these cases had significance beyond their immediate participants. They provided hope and inspiration for other young women facing similar circumstances, and they helped establish precedents that occasionally benefited future generations. The fact that we know about these resistance efforts at all indicates that medieval society found them noteworthy enough to record. And remember, the long-term impact of resistance efforts on medieval marriage practices is difficult to assess. But some gradual changes in family attitudes toward children's preferences suggest that persistent resistance may have contributed to evolving social norms. Families who experienced the costs and complications of forcing unwilling daughters into marriage sometimes became more flexible in their approach to subsequent children, creating ripple effects that extended beyond individual cases. Still, if you thought medieval child marriage was uniform across Europe, think again. A 12-year-old girl's experience varied dramatically depending on whether she was born in England, France, Italy, or the Germanic kingdoms, and these regional differences often meant the difference between relative safety and extreme danger. We're talking about a continent where traveling a few hundred miles could completely change the legal protections, social expectations, and survival chances for young brides. Let's start with what might surprise you. Some regions were actually more protective of young girls than others. Though, protective is obviously a relative term when we're still talking about child marriage. Northern European kingdoms like England and the Germanic states generally had stronger legal frameworks requiring genuine consent for marriage, while some Mediterranean regions operated under legal systems that gave fathers nearly absolute authority over their daughters' fates. To be fair, these regional differences weren't arbitrary. They reflected different legal traditions, economic systems, and cultural values that had developed over centuries. Roman law, which still influenced legal systems in much of southern Europe, traditionally gave fathers extensive power over their children's marriages. Meanwhile, Germanic legal traditions, which influenced northern European law, had somewhat stronger protections for individual consent, though these protections were still limited by modern standards. The economic systems in different regions also shaped marriage practices in significant ways. Areas with strong commercial economies, like northern Italian city-states or Flemish trading centers, often had more flexible approaches to marriage because merchant families needed to adapt quickly to changing business opportunities. Meanwhile, regions with primarily agricultural economies typically had more rigid marriage patterns focused on land inheritance and long-term family alliances. Of course, the strength of church authority varied significantly across different regions, and this had major implications for young brides. Areas where bishops had significant political power often had stricter enforcement of canonical marriage laws, including requirements for consent and minimum ages. Regions where secular authorities dominated might pay lip service to church law, while allowing practices that violated canonical requirements when politically expedient. The Italian city-states present particularly interesting case studies in regional variation. In wealthy commercial centers like Venice or Florence, merchant families often delayed their daughters' marriages until ages 14 or 15, since these extra years allowed for more sophisticated education and training that could benefit family businesses. Meanwhile, rural Italian regions might follow more traditional patterns of marriage at 12 or 13, reflecting different economic priorities and social structures. Meanwhile, France presented its own unique patterns with significant differences between northern and southern regions. Northern France, influenced by both Germanic legal traditions and strong royal authority, generally had more structured approaches to marriage negotiations and somewhat better protections for young brides. Southern France, with its troubadour culture and more Mediterranean social patterns, had different attitudes toward love, marriage, and women's roles that could either help or hurt individual girls, depending on their specific circumstances. And yet, England developed some of the most interesting regional practices around child marriage. The strong royal legal system meant that marriage laws were more consistently enforced across the kingdom than in many continental regions. English common law also developed some unique protections for married women's property rights that gave wives more economic security than their counterparts in other countries, though these protections were still limited by contemporary standards. The Germanic kingdoms and the Holy Roman Empire presented a patchwork of different legal systems and marriage practices that could vary dramatically from one duchy or principality to another. A girl born in one region might face completely different marriage prospects than her cousin living just a few territories away, depending on local laws, customs, and the political relationships between ruling families. Spain's unique position as a frontier region between Christian and Muslim societies created distinctive marriage patterns that differed from the rest of Europe. The ongoing Reconquista meant that many families were focused on military alliances and territorial consolidation, which could either accelerate marriage arrangements for strategic purposes or delay them if families were too involved in warfare. To focus on domestic arrangements. Still, we shouldn't overstate these regional differences. The fundamental reality of child marriage existed across medieval Europe, regardless of local variations in law and custom. The differences were often matters of degree rather than kind, involving questions about specific ages, consent procedures, or economic arrangements, rather than whether child marriage should occur at all. The development of trade networks and increased communication between regions gradually began to standardize some marriage practices, but this process was slow and uneven. Merchant families who operated across multiple regions often had to navigate different legal systems and cultural expectations for their various daughters, creating complex family strategies that adapted to local conditions while maintaining overall family goals. By the 14th century, the growth of universities and increased scholarly communication was beginning to create more standardized approaches to marriage law across different regions. Canon lawyers trained at universities like Bologna or Paris carried similar ideas about marriage requirements to different parts of Europe, gradually reducing some of the extreme variations in local practice. The impact of warfare on regional marriage patterns was also significant. Regions that experienced frequent conflict often had accelerated marriage timelines, since families wanted to secure alliances and ensure their daughters' safety before military campaigns disrupted normal social patterns. Meanwhile, areas with greater political stability could afford more leisurely approaches to marriage negotiations. Climate and geography also influenced regional marriage patterns in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Northern regions with harsh winters and shorter growing seasons often had different economic cycles that affected marriage timing, while Mediterranean regions with different agricultural patterns might have entirely different seasonal rhythms. For family celebrations and alliance building, the strength of guild systems in different regions created additional variations in marriage practices. Areas with strong craft guilds often had specific rules about marriages within and between different trades, while regions without well-developed guild systems might have more flexible approaches to occupational considerations and marriage arrangements. Religious diversity within nominally Christian Europe also created regional differences in marriage practices. Areas with significant Jewish or Muslim populations, or regions where heretical Christian movements had influence, often developed distinctive approaches to interfaith relationships and conversion marriages that differed from standard Catholic practices. The development of different vernacular languages and literary traditions also influenced regional attitudes toward marriage and romantic love. Regions with strong traditions of romantic literature might have populations that were more accepting of emotional considerations in marriage, while areas with more practical literary traditions might focus more heavily on economic and political factors. What emerges from examining these regional variations is a picture of medieval Europe as a continent of remarkable diversity in marriage practices, even within the overarching framework of child marriage. A girl's specific birthplace could significantly influence her marriage prospects, legal protections, and life chances in ways that modern people might find hard to imagine. The long-term consequences of these regional differences extended well beyond the medieval period. Areas that developed stronger legal protections for women or more flexible marriage practices often continued to be more progressive in their treatment of women's rights centuries later, while regions with more restrictive traditions sometimes maintained those patterns well into the modern era. Understanding these regional variations is crucial for avoiding oversimplified generalizations about medieval marriage. While child marriage was indeed widespread across medieval Europe, the specific experiences of young brides varied dramatically depending on where they happened to be born and raised. Geography was often destiny in ways that could mean the difference between a tolerable life and genuine tragedy. Let's be clear about something that makes the entire system of medieval child marriage even more disturbing when you really think about it. These weren't just social arrangements or family traditions. They were complex economic transactions where young girls essentially functioned as human currency in a sophisticated market system. We're talking about detailed financial negotiations, price calculations, and investment strategies that treated 12-year-old children as tradable commodities with specific market values determined by everything from their bloodlines to their potential fertility. The dowry system was the backbone of this economic framework. and it operated with a complexity that would impress modern financial analysts. A typical noble dowry negotiation involved not just immediate cash payments, but also land transfers, trade rights, future inheritance claims, and sometimes even military obligations that could span generations. That's right, when a 12-year-old girl got married, her family wasn't just giving away their daughter. They were essentially writing checks that their grandchildren might still be paying off decades later. To be fair, the economic logic behind these arrangements made sense within medieval society's constraints. In a world without social security systems, retirement plans, or government safety nets, marriage alliances were often the only way families could secure their long-term survival and prosperity. A well-negotiated marriage could provide military protection, trade partnerships, and political influence that could benefit entire extended families for generations. Still, the fact that this system made economic sense doesn't make it less problematic that children were the primary assets being traded. The calculation of a young bride's market value involved factors that seem bizarre by modern standards. Genealogists would trace bloodlines back multiple generations to establish claims to various titles and properties. Physical examinations by physicians or experienced women would assess reproductive potential. Even personality traits and educational accomplishments were assigned monetary values in marriage negotiations. Sound familiar? It's essentially a medieval version of modern data analytics, except the product being analyzed was a human child. Of course, the dowry amounts involved could be staggering by any historical standard. When Princess Isabella of Valois was married to King Richard II of England, her dowry included not just massive sums of gold, but also territorial claims in France that were worth more than entire kingdoms. Meanwhile, even modest noble families might spend the equivalent of years' worth of income to provide adequate dowries for their daughters. The economic pressure on families with multiple daughters could be absolutely crushing. Meanwhile, the market for young brides operated according to supply and demand principles that would be familiar to any economist. During periods of warfare, when young men were dying in large numbers, the marriage market became more favorable to families with daughters, since there were fewer available husbands competing for wives. Conversely, during peaceful periods with large numbers of eligible bachelors, families often had to offer larger dowries to secure acceptable marriages for their daughters. The regional variations in dowry practices created what were essentially different currency systems across medieval Europe. A dowry that represented enormous wealth in one kingdom might be considered modest in another, depending on local economic conditions and marriage customs. Families with daughters to marry had to become expert in these regional differences, essentially functioning as international traders navigating multiple markets simultaneously. And yet, the economic framework surrounding child marriage created some perverse incentives that often worked against the welfare of the children involved. Families had strong financial motivations to marry off daughters as young as possible, since younger brides typically required smaller dowries than older ones. A 12-year-old girl was considered a better economic investment than a 16-year-old, not because she was more mature or ready for marriage, but because she was cheaper to purchase and had more potential childbearing years ahead of her. The church's involvement in these economic arrangements was both hypocritical and profitable. While church authorities preached about the spiritual nature of marriage and the importance of consent, they also collected substantial fees for performing wedding ceremonies, granting dispensations, and resolving marriage disputes. A complex noble marriage could generate enough church revenue to fund monastery construction or cathedral renovation projects. The more complicated the marriage arrangements, the more money the church made from the various legal and religious services required. By the 13th century, specialized professions had developed around the marriage market that functioned essentially like medieval investment banking. Professional marriage negotiators, dowry assessors, and genealogical researchers commanded high fees for their expertise in navigating the complex economic and legal aspects of marriage arrangements. These professionals maintained detailed records of family finances, political relationships, and market conditions that influenced marriage values across different regions and time periods. The insurance aspects of medieval marriage were also remarkably sophisticated. Marriage contracts often included specific provisions for what would happen if wives died in childbirth, if husbands died in warfare, or if political circumstances changed the value of territorial claims included in dowries. These risk management strategies required careful legal planning and often involved multiple backup arrangements to protect family investments under various scenarios. Still, the economic pressure created by dowry requirements often forced families into desperate financial strategies that could have devastating consequences. Some families borrowed heavily to fund their daughters' dowries, essentially mortgaging their futures on the hope that the resulting marriage alliances would provide sufficient returns to justify the investment. When these strategies failed, entire families could face financial ruin that affected multiple generations. The development of merchant banking systems during the later medieval period began to create new opportunities and challenges for families navigating the marriage market. International banking networks could facilitate dowry payments across different kingdoms and currencies, but they also introduced new forms of financial risk related to exchange rates, credit arrangements, and political stability. A dowry negotiated in one currency might be worth significantly more or less by the time payments were actually due, depending on economic and political developments. Meanwhile, the rise of urban merchant families created a new category of marriage market participant that didn't fit neatly into traditional noble hierarchies. These families had substantial financial resources, but lacked aristocratic bloodlines, creating opportunities for mutually beneficial exchanges with established noble families who had prestigious names but needed ready cash. The resulting marriages often involved complex negotiations about social status, financial obligations, and political relationships that required considerable diplomatic skill to manage successfully. The seasonal rhythms of medieval economies also influenced marriage timing in ways that prioritized financial considerations over personal readiness. Harvest seasons, trade fairs, and political gatherings created natural opportunities for families to meet, negotiate, and finalize marriage arrangements. Young girls might find their marriage timing determined by grain prices or shipping schedules rather than their own developmental readiness or emotional preparation. The inheritance laws governing women's property rights varied significantly across different legal systems, creating additional complications for families planning marriage strategies. In some regions, women could inherit and control substantial properties, making them attractive marriage partners regardless of their dowry amounts. In other areas, women's inheritance rights were severely limited, making large dowries essential for securing advantageous marriages. Of course, the economic calculations surrounding marriage were often based on projections and assumptions that might not prove accurate over time. A marriage alliance designed to secure trade relationships might become worthless if political circumstances changed. Territorial claims included in dowries might be invalidated by military defeats or diplomatic agreements. Young wives who were expected to produce multiple male heirs might prove infertile or die in childbirth, making their marriages economic disasters for both families involved. The development of more sophisticated accounting methods during the later medieval period allowed families to track the costs and benefits of their marriage strategies with increasing precision. Detailed records of dowry payments, marriage-related expenses, and returns on marriage investments provided data that could inform future family planning decisions. These records also reveal the enormous financial resources that medieval families devoted to marriage arrangements, often representing the largest single expenditures in family budgets. The legal disputes that arose from failed marriage negotiations often involved substantial sums of money and could continue for years or even decades. Families who felt they had been cheated in marriage arrangements might pursue legal action to recover dowry payments or seek compensation for damages. These cases required expensive legal representation and often involved complex arguments about contract interpretation, property valuation, and family honor that went far beyond simple financial calculations. What emerges from examining the economic aspects of medieval child marriage is a picture of a system that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more ruthless than most people realize. The financial framework supporting these arrangements required considerable expertise and planning, but they operated on the fundamental assumption that young girls were essentially commodities, whose value could be calculated and traded like any other asset. The psychological impact on young girls of understanding that their marriages were primarily financial transactions must have been significant. Growing up knowing that your family's economic survival might depend on your ability to attract a high-value husband, and that your personal worth was being calculated based on factors completely outside your control, would create enormous pressure and potentially lasting psychological damage. The long-term economic consequences of these marriage systems extended far beyond individual families. The concentration of wealth and property through strategic marriages helped create the economic foundations for the political structures that dominated medieval and early modern Europe. The economic frameworks developed to support marriage arrangements also contributed to the development of banking, insurance, and investment systems that influenced European economic development for centuries. Understanding the economic dimensions of medieval child marriage helps explain both why the practice was so persistent and why it eventually began to change as economic conditions evolved. When the costs of maintaining these complex marriage systems began to outweigh their benefits, families gradually started adopting different strategies that were less dependent on extremely young brides and elaborate dowry arrangements. Meanwhile, let's address what might be the most important and least discussed aspect of medieval child marriage: the profound psychological impact on the children involved, and the remarkable resilience that many somehow managed to develop despite experiencing what we would now recognize as severe childhood trauma. If you thought medieval people were somehow less emotionally complex than modern humans, the evidence suggests that 12-year-old brides experienced the full range of human emotions: fear, grief, confusion, anger, and sometimes even hope. Just like children today, the initial trauma of being told about an arranged marriage could be devastating for young girls who had little understanding of what marriage actually involved. We're talking about children who might be informed of their impending weddings with as little as a few weeks' notice, suddenly learning that their entire futures had been decided without their input. That's right. Imagine being 12 years old and discovering that adults had been negotiating your life away while you were still playing with dolls and learning basic arithmetic. To be fair, some families did try to prepare their daughters gradually for the reality of arranged marriage, beginning conversations about future responsibilities and expectations years before actual wedding plans were finalized. But even in these cases, the abstract concept of eventual marriage was very different from the reality of specific arrangements with particular individuals. A girl who had accepted in principle that she would marry someday might still be shocked and frightened when presented with the reality of marrying a specific stranger within a matter of months. The psychological concept of learned helplessness, where individuals stop trying to change their circumstances because they believe resistance is futile, was probably common among young medieval brides. After witnessing older sisters or female relatives submit to arranged marriages despite their protests, many girls likely concluded that resistance was pointless and that acceptance was their only psychologically viable option. Sound familiar? This same dynamic appears in many situations where individuals face overwhelming institutional pressure. Of course, the lack of any real childhood preparation for adult sexuality and reproduction meant that young brides often faced their wedding nights with levels of anxiety that approached genuine terror. Medieval people had no understanding of psychological trauma or post-traumatic stress, but contemporary sources describe young wives who exhibited what we would now recognize as classic symptoms of trauma: nightmares, physical illness with no apparent medical cause, withdrawal from social interactions, and persistent FEARFULNESS. The isolation experienced by many young brides compounded their psychological distress. Marriage often meant leaving their birth families and moving to unfamiliar locations where they knew no one and had no established support networks. A 12-year-old girl who was already dealing with the trauma of forced marriage might also be coping with homesickness, culture shock, and the challenge of building relationships with people who viewed her primarily in terms of her functional value rather than her personal qualities. And yet, perhaps most remarkably, many young brides found ways to adapt to their circumstances and even create meaningful lives within impossible situations. The human capacity for psychological resilience is extraordinary, and medieval sources provide numerous examples of women who managed to develop genuine partnerships with their husbands, create supportive relationships within their new families, and find sources of satisfaction and purpose within their constrained circumstances. The development of coping mechanisms varied widely among young brides, depending on their personalities, resources, and specific circumstances. Some threw themselves into learning their new responsibilities, finding purpose and identity in becoming skilled household managers or political advisors. Others focused on building relationships with children, servants, or other women who could provide emotional support and companionship. Still others found solace in religious devotion, artistic pursuits, or intellectual activities that provided psychological escape from difficult realities. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of early pregnancy and motherhood created additional layers of complexity for young wives who were still children themselves. Becoming a mother at 13 or 14 meant taking on enormous emotional responsibilities, while still needing parental care and guidance themselves. The cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously child and adult, dependent and responsible, must have been psychologically exhausting. The lack of privacy in medieval life meant that young wives rarely had opportunities to process their experiences alone or seek confidential support for their emotional struggles. Their feelings, behaviors, and relationships were constantly observed and evaluated by family members, servants, and community members who had their own interests in the success or failure of marriage arrangements. This constant scrutiny made it difficult for young wives to express negative emotions or seek help when they were struggling psychologically. Still, some evidence suggests that networks of women within medieval communities provided informal psychological support for young brides, even when formal support systems were unavailable. Older women who had survived their own difficult marriages sometimes offered guidance, comfort, and practical advice to younger wives who were struggling with similar challenges. These relationships operated largely outside official family hierarchies and provided crucial emotional support for isolated young women. The religious frameworks available to medieval people offered both help and hindrance for young wives dealing with psychological trauma. On one hand, religious beliefs about suffering, endurance, and divine purpose could provide meaning and context for difficult experiences. On the other hand, religious teachings that blamed women for sexual desire emphasized submission to male authority, and discouraged complaints about divinely ordained circumstances could prevent young wives from seeking help or even acknowledging their own emotional needs. By the 14th century, some medical texts were beginning to recognize what we might now call depression and anxiety as legitimate medical conditions, though their understanding of these problems was primitive and their treatments were often ineffective or harmful. Young wives who exhibited persistent sadness, fearfulness, or withdrawal might be diagnosed with melancholia and treated with herbal remedies, bloodletting, or religious interventions that rarely address the underlying causes of their distress. The development of romantic literature during the later medieval period created both opportunities and challenges for young wives dealing with emotional trauma. Stories of passionate love and romantic fulfillment could provide psychological escape and hope for better relationships, but they could also highlight the gap between literary ideals and lived reality in ways that made actual circumstances seem even more disappointing and frustrating. Of course, the most severe cases of psychological distress sometimes led to tragic outcomes that medieval people attributed to everything except the obvious causes. Young wives who committed suicide, died from mysterious illnesses, or exhibited what we would now recognize as severe mental illness were often described as victims of supernatural influences, moral failings, or divine punishment rather than psychological trauma resulting from their treatment as children. The intergenerational transmission of trauma was also significant, though medieval people had no framework for understanding this phenomenon. Women who had been traumatized by their own childhood marriages sometimes unconsciously perpetuated similar patterns with their own daughters, either because they genuinely believed that suffering was normal and necessary, or because they lacked the emotional resources to protect their children from experiences they had endured themselves. Meanwhile, the few young wives who managed to develop genuinely positive relationships with their husbands often became models for other women in their communities, demonstrating that happiness was possible even within arranged marriages. These success stories provided hope and practical examples for other young wives, showing them strategies for building affection and partnership within constrained circumstances. The long-term, psychological consequences of childhood marriage often shaped women's entire adult lives in ways that extended far beyond their immediate family relationships. Women who had learned early that their own desires and preferences were irrelevant to major life decisions might struggle throughout their lives with self-advocacy, decision-making, and assertiveness. Conversely, women who had successfully navigated the challenges of early marriage sometimes developed exceptional resilience and competence that served them well in other difficult situations. The development of more nuanced understanding of human psychology during the Renaissance period began to create new frameworks for thinking about emotional trauma and recovery. Though these ideas were initially limited to intellectual circles and didn't immediately translate into practical support for individuals suffering from psychological distress. Still, the gradual recognition that emotional well-being was important for overall health represented a significant step toward understanding the psychological costs of practices like child marriage. What emerges from examining the psychological aspects of medieval child marriage is a picture of remarkable human resilience in the face of institutionalized trauma. While many young wives suffered enormously from their experiences, others found ways to create meaningful and even happy lives within impossible circumstances. Their adaptations and coping strategies demonstrate the extraordinary capacity of human beings to survive and sometimes thrive even under conditions that would be considered traumatic by any reasonable standard. The survival of personal documents, letters, and artistic works created by medieval women provides glimpses into their inner lives that reveal the full complexity of their emotional experiences. These sources show women who were capable of deep feeling, sophisticated thinking, and creative expression, even when their circumstances severely limited their opportunities for personal fulfillment and self-determination. Understanding the psychological dimensions of medieval child marriage helps explain both the immediate human costs of these practices and their long-term consequences for individuals, families, and society as a whole. The trauma experienced by young brides didn't exist in isolation. It affected their relationships with their children, their participation in community life, and their ability to contribute to society in ways that might have benefited everyone. The gradual evolution away from the most extreme forms of child marriage during the later medieval period may have been influenced partly by growing recognition of the psychological costs involved, even if medieval people didn't have modern vocabulary for describing these problems. Families who witnessed the emotional devastation that could result from forcing extremely young girls into unwanted marriages sometimes became more cautious about their approach to subsequent children, creating gradual changes in practice that accumulated over time. And yet, slowly and unevenly across medieval Europe, attitudes toward child marriage began to shift. The changes weren't sudden or universal, and they certainly weren't driven by modern concepts of children's rights, but by the 14th and 15th centuries. Various social, economic, and cultural forces were beginning to challenge the practice of marrying off 12-year-old girls. If you thought medieval society was incapable of moral progress, the gradual evolution away from the most extreme forms of child marriage suggests that even deeply entrenched practices could eventually be questioned and reformed. Let's be clear about what drove these changes, because it's important to understand that the shift away from child marriage wasn't primarily motivated by concern for children's welfare. Instead, it was the result of practical problems that made the practice less beneficial for the families and institutions that had previously supported it. That's right. Medieval society didn't suddenly develop modern sensibilities about childhood, but they did gradually recognize that marrying off extremely young girls created more problems than it solved. The economic changes of the later medieval period played a major role in shifting marriage patterns. As commercial economies became more complex and trade relationships more important, families began to recognize that daughters who received more education and training could be more valuable marriage partners. A 16-year-old bride who could read, write, manage accounts, and speak multiple languages was more attractive to merchant families than a 12-year-old who had barely learned basic household skills. To be fair, this shift wasn't universally positive for young women. In some ways, it simply created different forms of pressure and different types of training that were still focused on making girls more useful to their families rather than developing their individual potential. But it did mean that many girls gained a few extra years of childhood and received more sophisticated education before marriage, which represented genuine improvements in their circumstances. The medical developments of the later medieval period also began to influence attitudes toward early marriage and pregnancy. While medical understanding was still primitive by modern standards, physicians and midwives were beginning to document the increased risks associated with very young mothers. Some medical texts from the 14th century explicitly warned against consummating marriages with girls under 14, citing health risks that had been observed in clinical practice. Meanwhile, the Church's evolving theology around marriage was creating new frameworks for thinking about consent and readiness for matrimony. While church authorities still supported relatively early marriage ages, some theologians were beginning to argue that true consent required not just legal capacity, but emotional and intellectual maturity that might not develop until later adolescence. These arguments didn't immediately change church law, but they provided intellectual foundations for future reforms. Of course, The devastating impact of the Black Death in the 14th century created demographic pressures that temporarily accelerated some child marriage practices, as families struggled to rebuild populations and secure inheritances in the face of massive mortality. But the same demographic crisis also created opportunities for survivors that gradually led to improved conditions for women, including delayed marriage ages in some regions. The rise of humanism during the early Renaissance period brought new ideas about individual dignity and human potential that began to influence thinking about children and marriage. Humanist philosophers like Christine de Pizan argued that women were capable of reason and moral development that required time and education to mature properly. While these ideas were initially limited to intellectual circles, they gradually began to influence broader social attitudes. And yet, perhaps the most significant factor in changing marriage patterns was the increasing complexity of political alliances and economic relationships. As kingdoms became more centralized and international diplomacy more sophisticated, marriage negotiations became so complex that they often required years of planning and negotiation. This complexity naturally led to delays in marriage timing, since families needed more time to evaluate options and negotiate terms. The development of more sophisticated legal systems also created new protections for young people in marriage arrangements. Courts began to take seriously claims of coercion or incapacity, and legal procedures for challenging unwanted marriages became more accessible to families who had the resources to pursue them. While these legal protections were still limited and unevenly enforced, they represented important steps toward recognizing children's rights within marriage negotiations. By the 15th century, some regions were beginning to see average marriage ages creep upward, with noble families often delaying their daughters' marriages until ages 14 or 15 rather than 12 or 13. This shift wasn't dramatic or universal, but it represented a meaningful change in social norms that benefited thousands of young women across Europe. Still, we shouldn't overstate the pace or completeness of these changes. Child marriage by modern standards continued to be common throughout the medieval period and well into the early modern era. The shifts that occurred were often matters of degree, moving average marriage ages from 12 to 14, or from 14 to 16, rather than eliminating early marriage altogether. So where does this leave us in understanding what it was really like to be married at 12 in medieval times? If you came into this expecting either a romanticized fairy tale or a simple story of universal suffering, I hope it's clear by now that the reality was far more complex, varied, and nuanced than either of those narratives would suggest. Let's be honest about what we've discovered. Medieval child marriage was simultaneously a practical necessity within the constraints of its time and a practice that caused genuine trauma and suffering for countless young people. The fact that it made sense within medieval social and economic systems doesn't make it less problematic, but understanding those systems helps us appreciate both how these practices developed and how they eventually began to change. To be fair, medieval people weren't cartoon villains deliberately inflicting suffering on children. They were operating within worldviews that prioritized family survival, political stability, and social order over individual happiness and personal choice. Their decisions about marriage timing were based on assumptions about childhood, sexuality, and family life that seem obviously wrong to modern observers, but that were logical within their contemporary understanding of biology, psychology, and social necessity. The regional variations we've explored demonstrate that medieval Europe wasn't monolithically oppressive toward young women. Some legal systems provided better protections than others. Some families were more considerate of their daughters' welfare than others. And some communities developed practices that minimized the harmful effects of early marriage even when they couldn't eliminate them entirely. These variations remind us that human societies are capable of finding more and less humane approaches to difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, the stories of resistance and rebellion reveal that medieval young people had the same capacity for independent thought and emotional complexity as their modern counterparts. The fact that most resistance efforts failed doesn't diminish the courage and intelligence of young women who challenged systems that seemed absolutely fixed and unchangeable. Their efforts contributed to gradual social changes that eventually benefited future generations. The evolution of attitudes toward child marriage during the later medieval period offers hope that even deeply entrenched practices can change when social, economic, and cultural conditions shift. The transformation wasn't rapid or complete, but it demonstrated that societies are capable of moral progress, even when that progress is slow and imperfect. Of course, we should also acknowledge the lasting trauma and lost potential represented by medieval child marriage practices. Thousands of young women were denied educations, career opportunities, and life choices that might have allowed them to develop their full human potential. Many died young from pregnancy complications that could have been avoided with different social priorities. Others lived entire lives constrained by marriages they had never chosen and relationships they couldn't escape. And yet, perhaps most remarkably, many of these young women found ways to create meaningful lives within impossible circumstances. They developed genuine partnerships with their husbands, raised children they loved, managed complex households with skill and intelligence, and contributed to their communities in ways that were significant and lasting. Their resilience and adaptation don't justify the systems that constrain them, but they do remind us of the extraordinary human capacity to find purpose and even happiness within difficult circumstances. The comparison between medieval child marriage and modern practices raises uncomfortable questions about our own society's treatment of young people. While we've eliminated legal child marriage in most Western societies, we haven't eliminated all forms of exploitation or lack of agency for minors. Understanding medieval practices can help us think more clearly about contemporary issues involving children's rights, family authority, and social responsibility. Still, it's important to recognize the genuine progress that has occurred since medieval times. Modern young people have legal protections, educational opportunities, and personal autonomy that would have been unimaginable to their medieval counterparts. The gradual expansion of childhood, the development of concepts like adolescence, and the recognition of children's rights represent significant moral advances that shouldn't be taken for granted. The medieval period also reminds us how much individual circumstances could vary even within oppressive systems. A 12-year-old noble bride with supportive family members, experienced advisors, and access to resources had vastly different prospects than a peasant girl with none of these advantages. Social class, geographic location, family attitudes, and personal characteristics all influenced outcomes in ways that could mean the difference between tolerable and tragic circumstances. What emerges most clearly from this examination is the importance of understanding historical practices within their full context rather than making simplistic judgments based on modern values. Medieval child marriage was wrong by contemporary standards, but understanding why it developed and how it functioned helps us think more clearly about family relationships, social change, and human adaptation to difficult circumstances. The stories of individual medieval women, both those who submitted to unwanted marriages and those who found ways to resist, remind us that history is made up of real people facing real choices within the constraints of their time and place. Their experiences were as valid and meaningful as our own, even when they occurred within systems we now recognize as harmful. Perhaps most importantly, studying medieval child marriage helps us appreciate both how far human societies have progressed in recognizing children's rights and dignity, and how recent and fragile those advances really are. The legal protections and social norms to prevent child marriage in modern Western societies develop gradually over centuries and require ongoing vigilance to maintain. The complexity and nuance revealed in this examination should serve as a reminder that human societies are always more complicated than they appear from the outside, and that moral progress is possible even when it's slow and incomplete. Understanding the past doesn't require us to excuse its failings, but it can help us think more clearly about our own contemporary challenges and responsibilities. So the next time someone mentions medieval times, you'll know that the reality was neither the romantic fairy tale of popular imagination nor the unrelieved darkness of common stereotypes, but something more complex, more human, and ultimately more instructive for understanding both where we've been and where we might be going as a society.